Evening and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. We have tonight Nick Humphrey and Jennifer Hynes with me, Sandy Schoelles. And tonight should be a pretty spirited conversation. We've got a lot of weather, a lot of climate change. We've got flooding. I mean, we've got a lot of things. And then we have other
Yeah.
things to talk about, which are resilience and mitigation of these things for people that are involved. And there's also what to expect with animals and wildlife in these floods. So I'm going to start off with giving it to you, Nick, so that you can give us the synopsis of just what the hell is going on. And then, Jennifer, you pick up from there.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Hell breaking loose. I don't really know what else to put it. It's been a kind of a rough week as far as the extreme weather events are concerned. I mean, we've been seeing incredible heat and destructive wildfires in the boreal forests of Alaska. Heat in excess of 90 degrees across wide swaths of Alaska, and Anchorage had its first 90-degree day on record.
Mm-hmm.
And the records, go back to the turn of the century, so very, very hot in Alaska. At the same time, we're seeing a tropical storm, soon to be Hurricane Barry, approaching Louisiana, moving very, very slowly, much like many of the storms we've been seeing the past few years, hitting the U.S. Very slow, creeping motion. So as a result of that, there's expected to be in excess of 20 inches of rain possible in parts of southern Louisiana this weekend. Much of it will fall in the next 48 to 72 hours, although there was already a major urban flood event I believe it was on Thursday, in New Orleans proper. They had major flash flooding in parts of the city, low-lying areas of the city. So it's been very bad there. And we have building heat in the southwest U.S. I just actually saw before I came on, Phoenix had a tide this morning, a record high minimum temperature. So the highest minimum temperature to date on this date of 91 degrees, a morning low of 91 in Phoenix. And their highs are going into 110s, and it's looking like next week we're going to see wide swaths of the plains and Midwest having either actual temperatures or heat indices well over 100 degrees. So,
oh my God.
Yeah, including here in eastern Nebraska, I could see many places over 100 degrees. So it's a lot of craziness going on just in the United States as far as heat, flooding, fire. Particularly in the Arctic right now, and the sea ice is declining very, very rapidly, basically on the pace with 2012.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's pretty serious out there. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. I know in Louisiana, though, they've had the flooding. And who else has had flooding? A lot of people in
in Nebraska. We saw flooding from just what would seem like normal rainstorms, thunderstorms. Midweek, they dumped. Some areas got 3 to 4 inches of rain within a couple of hours, and there was flash flooding, and some of the rivers in far southern south central Nebraska are going to exceed records that were set in March, in the March flooding. So
Wow.
it's a lot of water that came down in a very short period of time. Some places got, like I said, 5 to 7 inches, maybe within an 8-hour period, but in some cases 2 to 3 of those inches fell in an hour or two. So it was a lot of water. And then we saw the major flash flooding in a month's worth of rain in an hour in Washington, D.C. Earlier this week. Yeah, that was a big deal. They have flooding in the basement of the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This article here you posted that is U.S. has its wettest 12 months on record again, and that's what got me started researching how people cope with all of this, and that's what I'll talk about a little bit later. Jen, what have
Yeah.
you been researching?
Well, you know what just strikes me is how extreme everything is getting. And it's like, I think we need a new term for this time that we're in, like extreme emergency climate disruption. The wet places are wetter, the dry places are drier, the hot places are hotter, and places you don't expect to get hot are experiencing extreme heat. And this heat in Alaska and the fires that it's brought is especially concerning because it is so hot and dry up there that there's almost like spontaneous ignition. And these fires just feed themselves and it becomes like fire nados, and it's very, very scary. I saw a chart that just scared me so much because it showed the amount of carbon dioxide that's been pushed into the atmosphere by these summer fires, specifically in Alaska. And it showed like all the different, years going along. And yeah, we had some, a little bit here, a little bit here. And then it showed what? 2019. Whew. I mean, not even in the same ballpark, not even hardly in the same magnitude. Off the charts and unprecedented is an overused phrase at this point, but it really suits the situation. And it's shocking. I just watched Paul Beckwith's interview right before coming onto this show, and he was talking about Tropical Storm Barry and giving his full Paul Beckwith analysis in 15 minutes or less. It's amazing how he sums it up. And he was showing, basically, I mean, we may be in for something pretty serious here in New Orleans that we haven't seen. I mean, we all remember Katrina in 2005, right? And that was like the worst thing that had ever happened that you could ever even imagine happening. Even though, I mean, don't be put off by this thing only being a tropical storm. The amount of moisture and slowness and power and size that this, quote, tropical storm Barry is packing is amazing. And the progressions and the charts that Paul showed on his latest video showed that part of the storm that pushes towards land, right when it hits landfall, it's going to be basically right into the city of New Orleans. And New Orleans, from what I could see, I mean, this thing could be a perfect storm. We don't know. We're going to have to keep an eye on it for the next couple of days, because Tropical Storm Barry, it could be a game changer in that there is just so much, if you saw kind of the fierceness, even of the pre-storm, the waves crashing against the steps and very wild. And Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans is right between Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River. And they're both so swollen right now. Plus the sea surge. I mean, it is what it is, and we live in these times, and so it's just amazing to kind of watch these unprecedented fires in Alaska, off the charts, just killing any CO2 conservation we might have had. And then on the other hand, you have Tropical Storm Barry just about to bear down on New Orleans. Yeah, we live in exciting times.
Yeah.
Nicholas,
Yeah, I mean,
I have a question about that. Just what Jennifer was saying. They said it was going to be maybe a category 1. So what's your assessment of Barry?
Well, I mean,
Jen just scared me.
As far as Barry, as far as the wind strength, I don't, just because it's getting so close to the land, I don't expect it to get much stronger than a category 1. But but the problem, as Jennifer points out, is the problem we've been seeing, in the United States this year and many parts of the world, is the power of water. And it's the danger of Barry is that by itself, it could dump an insane amount of rain, and it's gotten to the point where I'm looking back, because I've been, tracking meteorology since, tracking weather since I was a little kid. I remember, when I, back in 92, when I was 8 years old, watching Hurricane Andrew and other storms. It's harder. I'm starting to realize I don't remember so many storms in this part of the world dumping such huge amounts of rainfall. It does happen. There's isolated places that can get over 20 inches of rain and 30 inches of rain even, but you're starting to see storms that are in this part of the world without huge mountain ranges or anything to squeeze out every drop of moisture that are routinely dumping huge amounts of rainfall. And that's a combination of the storm itself feeding off warmer ocean waters, so there's higher evaporation. The air mass that it exists in, on average, is warmer now because of climate change. So it has what we call a higher saturation mixing ratio. It's a fancy term for basically the maximum amount of water that the water vapor the atmosphere can hold per kilogram of dry air. So the higher the temperature, the higher the saturation point is, basically. And then on top of that, because the circulation patterns that drive the storm's steering currents are slowing down, and that's been noted to be happening over the past 60 or 70 years. But certainly it's likely accelerating in the past 10 or 20 years because of acceleration in climate change. And so because of that, you have storms that by themselves are capable of dropping more rain per hour, and then the storms are moving slower. So over the accumulation, the storm total accumulations are ridiculously high. So you could get, an event that may last, instead of a quick 6 or 8 hours with 2 to 3 inches an hour, you might get 12-hour event that's 3 to 6 inches per hour, like sort of Harvey did and Florence did in the past couple of years. Or we can't forget about the hurricane that passed close to Hawaii last year as well, and dumped a huge amount of rain on the Big Island of Hawaii. And obviously the Big Island also had mountainous terrain that made it worse too. So because of that by itself is bad. But on top of it, you have all of the flooding from the historic flood events that have occurred upstream in the Missouri River, Mississippi River, and it drains ultimately into the lower Mississippi Basin in the floodplains there.
Yeah.
And in, all these rivers that have been flooding in Oklahoma and in Kansas, in Nebraska, they all ultimately feed into the Mississippi system. And if you have that happening, ongoing elevated water levels, then you have this storm that's going to dump 15 to 20 or more inches of rain over the river. All that water is going to flow into the river, and then it produces a storm surge, which in and of itself, the storm surge is 3 to 5 feet. It's going to be probably 3 to 5 feet in a lot of parts of coastal Louisiana, which by itself is not an extreme surge. It can hurt you if you're right on the coast, but otherwise it's not something that would be considered extreme like Katrina was. But on top of that water level rise, you have the river flooding and the freshwater flooding that's ongoing, and then more that will be dumped by Barry. So that's the perfect storm, is basically everything that Barry can do, plus what's happened in the past, all this accumulative effects producing a big event. And that's what happened with the flooding in Nebraska and Iowa back in March. It was 3 or 4 storms worth of snow that melted within 24 to 48 hours. And it's one thing I've noticed a lot with these huge disasters, is that they're all built on previous events that weren't disasters.
Wow.
And it seems to be becoming more frequent. These extreme events are in fact events that occurred because of either other previous disasters led up to them, or just previous normal events, or seemingly normal events, or maybe abnormal events, but weren't destructive, lead to destruction later on.
It's pretty hairy here. We've had abnormal amounts of rain. I've been videoing it and making little vignettes, and things because we've had more rain than I ever remember, and it is going to rain again. And it's been so wet that the trees in my yard are showing stress from the water. It looks like it's fall. It is July 12th,
Yeah.
and the wind was blowing, and the trees are losing leaves, and they are yellowing. And I read about them today, and it could be it's stress, weather stress, and that brings up nutrients, lack of nutrients. It has a lack of nutrients, so it's far reaching. But I feel like we've turned in Western New York to the Pacific Northwest, and they're not getting the weather, are they? They're getting drought there. They're not getting
Yeah,
rain.
they're getting drought.
It's strange.
Yeah, I mean, they're one of the few parts of the U.S. that are getting drought. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about Colorado?
Here in Colorado, we've had an incredibly wet June and July. We're almost halfway into July now, being in July 12th today. And the hailstorms have been really fierce. And they'll come down suddenly, and they'll kind of like be on the edge of these big fronts that are fueled with like tropical moisture, like all this moisture that comes up from Baja. And I think Baja, that whole Gulf in there is super hot. And I think that is just evaporating and fueling these incredible storms, and they come rolling through, and they're tons of lightning, and they're super fierce. And then they're dropping these hailstones. And I went out and I was checking out my neighbor's car, because I'm like, that car was out there during this hailstone thing. And I mean, they're like little marbles, and a lot of them, and it comes down suddenly. And it's like there's a certain fierceness in the weather that I'm seeing now that I haven't seen before right here in Colorado.
Well, there is here. I documented it, and I uploaded, and I made a video to Facebook of my husband and I driving through what looked like a tornadic activity. We had hail. It was insane. But of course, he made me laugh the whole way home. And I videoed all kinds of stuff and then spliced it together because it was insane. It's insane.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yeah. I've noticed we had a period a few weeks ago of numerous thunderstorms coming in every morning. Basically it'll wake me up like it's 5 to 7 in the morning. And I mean, it's typical to get these storms that form off the high plains and then come over our area, usually by daybreak. So that in of itself wasn't abnormal. What was simply abnormal was just the huge amount of lightning in them. I mean, it was just like bang, 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 bang. It was like, wow, this is I've lived here a long time, and there's a lot of lightning.
Wow.
And cloud to ground lightning. So it's like I look out my window, and there's just like huge strikes that within a mile or 2 miles of me, and it's like, man, this is these storms aren't in and of themselves aren't severe storms. They're not producing giant hail. It's just some rain, but the convection, the upward motion that generates these static charges was extremely violent.
Nick, do you have any idea how lightning is increasing these days? Do you have any stats on that? Because it really feels to me like lightning is really increasing along with everything else, and I haven't heard too much about that.
I don't know the exact statistic. I have read a couple of peer review papers that deal with lightning and climate change. I think it's like maybe 14 or 15% increase in lightning globally is expected per degree of warming. So we probably have already seen an increase in lightning just from the warming that's occurred. And obviously, just like any other weather statistic, you're going to get storms that produce extremes that are much greater than the average, which in this case would mean lightning storms there might be individual lightning storms that are just ridiculously more energetic than would be expected.
Wow.
So it's a big threat because people get killed in lightning in outside of the United States, where there isn't necessarily an advanced warning system for significant storms that move through the area. You can get a lot of people that get killed. I mean, I heard of some lightning deaths recently in Bangladesh. Like dozens of people got killed from lightning strikes because, I mean, you know, people are either out and about or they're farming or something. A storm comes overhead. They don't think anything of it. And then it produces a ton of cloud to ground lightning that goes around and can kill you. Particularly if you're out in maybe an agricultural field. If there's water on the ground, rice paddies, you're in the water, and the water conducts electricity. You get a whole bunch of people that get electrocuted. So, you know, if you're near the water, so I mean, it's, you know, lightning's kind of that danger that doesn't get discussed very much, but it's easy to get killed by it if there's a lot of it coming out of the clouds to the ground.
Pretty scary. There's a lot of comments on that. Mike says more particulate matter in the atmosphere is a conduit to lightning. Hi, Mike. And Matt and Torstein and Greg and Meryl and Michael and a lot of people are here. So Buddy and Keith and Dolores, you know, Kim. I just had to say hi to everybody. You know, break it up a little bit. Hey, can I go into something real quick? I wanted to talk about, since Louisiana, we're going to have floods, right? And we don't talk about the cost to animals per se. So I pulled up what to expect, and I pulled up the Louisiana government page on animals, and they talk about wildlife displaced by flooding, and they have recommendations: avoid areas where displaced wildlife has taken refuge because they're going to come. Rising waters will move wildlife from flooded habitat into adjacent residential and commercial areas, and they might come in contact with people. Avoid interaction with and don't feed them, because then they'll never go away. That's what they said. But, species of concern in Louisiana: black bear. The Louisiana black bear remains on the federal threatened and endangered species, and this species is of concern during a flood incident when high water moves bears out of their habitat within the Mississippi alluvial valley. And then alligators and snakes. Floodwaters will carry reptiles into populated areas. But, you know, people are talking about these animals, but these are, you know, they're getting displaced from their natural habitats. Deer, feral hogs, there's feral hogs down there. Deer and feral hog populations within the Mississippi alluvial valley represent two large quadrupled species that may appear in populated areas in significant numbers as floodwaters move wild animals out of natural habitat. So we can't forget, you know, we cannot forget the animals. We can't forget. I don't know what the agricultural farming is like in Louisiana, but we can't forget that the animals exist too. It's not just the humans, which I'll talk about in a little bit too.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I saw something on the news having to do with this new tropical storm coming into New Orleans. And apparently there are about 50 animals so far that need to be adopted that they've already rescued. So they have like rescue crews going around and actively trying to get animals that people leave behind. Apparently, when people evacuate, a lot of times either they can't find their animals or something happens. So those are people's animals. And then all those animals that are getting displaced. I mean, think of, you know, the city is just one part. The rest of that area is probably full of animals, and they're all going to be running for their lives too.
Yep. And that's a lot of times we just don't talk about it. You know, we talk about the effect of how awful all the weather is, but we forget about these critters and people's pets. And, you know, if anybody has links, we'll put them up for these adoption places. I have before. And then there's a guy that has a Facebook page that rescues animals he's rescued from fires. I don't know if he's going to floods, but I'll get his link up too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these extreme weather events from, you know, abrupt climate change, they destroy or take or reclaim, you know, habitats from not only people. You know, our habitat is as sort of a species that's sort of self contained itself. Our habitat is largely cities, towns, communities that sit in the same place. For the animals, it's the forest, it's the grasslands that remain, it's some of the areas that they've tried to coexist with humans, like the cities or the farms. And these events, they take take from not only humans but from the other animals that are out there. And so it's one of the interesting, well, humans would consider it a problem because it encroaches on their habitat. But
Yeah.
something happens somewhere else, so like the polar bears have no place to go because their sea ice is limited, so they go into the towns in Russia and start trying to eat out of the garbage because they can't find any food. They can't find any food because their sea ice is gone. That's gonna get much, or the sea lions that have no that just crowd beaches in the Arctic because of lack of sea ice to sit on, or obviously there were animals that probably were in a lot of these areas around the rivers that got flooded in Nebraska and Iowa, and now we're seeing the same deal in Louisiana. The more of these extremes that you get, the harder it is for them to be able to adapt, just like we're trying to adapt. We're trying to adapt by using our brains and build bigger walls and better streets and try to control the rivers more. The animals there, they just try to either run away, come back if the land is available to them again, but eventually, either floods permanently, gets covered in sand, or something else happens. The trees die from extreme heat, drought. And what do the animals do then? They
Right.
try to migrate, or they die, just like humans will
Yeah.
eventually be doing. Are already doing in India and Central America. You already have people in North Africa. People already trying to go north because their life, their lifestyles, or their livelihoods are being taken from them by the rage of nature, which is being driven by abrupt climate change and other problems, political problems, and other things. But in some cases, those problems that already existed are being amplified by the environmental problems that are growing.
And like Matt says, the amount of invasive species inside the Everglades is at an all-time high. And Matt's down there in Florida doing a lot of environmental work down there, and he's released thousands of frogs, and I mean, a lot. He's been doing some amazing work down there. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Matt.
He'll be with us soon enough. I keep saying that, and then I am so not organized properly. But anyway, everybody might think I am, but so Jen, tell me in your area, in events of climate disruption and things that happen there, how is your community prepared for this type of thing?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I don't know how my community is prepared because I guess I don't have that much interface directly with my neighbors, and that's probably a problem that most of us have. We have this internet community where we share our thoughts online with each other, and we have good friends, and although we've never met each other, you and I and you are all community for sure. We're all of the same tribe and we know it. But then you run across it would be better and easier to share if people were awakened at large, because it's not like, well, we have a little community and we all hold the same ideals and the same understandings, because we don't. Everybody is kind of sucked into their own little orbit with Netflix, and very little community per se. I'm trying to make community with all the people local I can find around here.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily live like right next door. It's not like a village community. Like in the old days, you'd have a tribe, and your hut would be next to all of your friends' huts and your relations and everything like that. And that would be a real little community. And you would have rites of passage, and you would have understandings of things, and you'd have storytelling around the fire, and you'd have legends that were shared among the community. And you'd also have all these deep, deep, deep friendships that evolve when you have kind of like that outside tribal society. We don't have that anymore. We don't have that same kind of community. So I can have like people who I can talk to about this and rely on within the area, maybe like 10 people or something like that. But that whole sense of tribal community where you help your neighbor and your neighbor helps you, I don't really see that happening right now. What do you?
Where I live, it's very rural, and we are connected. And
Okay.
I'm trying to work on things with my neighbors, maybe to be more connected. It's kind of hard though. I went to a town meeting, and I think some of the people are not ready or kind of clueless. But yet, it's a farming community, and there's a lot of progressives here. So people that do understand. It's local. It's little by little. Because as I'm going to demonstrate or read about in a bit in the research I found, people that are affected by these things have to accept that whatever they're affected by, a fire, a flood, whatever, that they've got to accept that it's climate change. And that's when the real action can happen. It's called the resilience paradox, which refers to the likelihood that reduced negative reactions to extreme weather may also mean diminished motivation to address climate change, which means that if they're numb, they have to understand it's climate change. People need to because mitigating, they need to be resilient, and they need to be able to understand how to mitigate the destruction, because we're still here. People are going to be living through this shit until we're not. So the
That's right.
out there, these guys, this is a pretty good article. I mean, it's not an article, it's a research project, and it is called the resilience paradox: flooding experience, coping, and climate change mitigation. Very good stuff. But of course, I'm a geek with it when it comes to psychology and behavior, and can't help it.
Yeah, I've kind of moved beyond the. I still obviously talk about it when new reports come out talking about individual attribution of a particular weather event to climate change and everything else, because it's important. But I've gotten to the point where I've started telling people more that the individual attribution isn't so much important. What's important is that we know climate change is happening. We know that there's an acceleration in the number of events, in the magnitude of their impact, how extreme they are. And so even though there's plenty of significant or severe events that happen that would have perhaps would have happened anyways if climate change hadn't occurred, there's enough where we've reached a point in the acceleration of abrupt climate change where what really matters is the cumulative effects of these events. As they, regardless of how much we can prove one specific event was influenced by climate change or made more likely by climate change, it's really the cumulative effect of all of these events piling up on each other. Like I said, New Orleans could, say New Orleans faces a flood event, a devastating flood event because of the Mississippi River. Hopefully that does not occur, but it could have happened. That would have been caused by events, of climate change impacting the tropical cyclone speed, giving it more moisture to dump heavier rain. It would have been caused by events that happened 4 months ago, when you had a huge flood that flooded the tributaries of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers and elevated the waters. Which would have in turn happened because of jet stream induced slowdown caused by Arctic amplification. You see, these cumulative effects of things that seemingly have nothing in common with each other that lead to this one big event 4 or 5 months down the line. That's what's happening. That's what's happening at this point, because you have changes in these circulation patterns that are so profound that they causes this kind of effect. And so for me, the idea of of kind of a realization for people that the extreme events we have are linked to climate change, I think is really important, because we're not living in a world that's quote unquote normal like it used to be, where things were stable. And so even if you had extreme events that would happen, like extreme droughts or extreme heat, like the all-time record high in Alaska is 100 degrees, and that was from 1914 or 1912. It had, as far as anyone knows, using the observation network, it hasn't been broken, even in the heat wave that they just had. It's still on the books in Fort Yukon, 100 degrees.
In
so
1914, what was that from?
That was probably just from, an extreme event. Like you had probably a high pressure system that is set up over there. You might have had some kind of topographic enhancement of like winds that came down a mountain range and enhanced heating locally in a couple of spots. So you got temperatures that were, maybe in the 90s, 100 degrees in a few spots. Most places probably didn't have that kind of heat. You get those kind of extremes that happen all over the world. It's like the Dust Bowl. Like climate change has still yet to exceed what happened during the Dust Bowl in most of the Great Plains. The record high in Lincoln, where I live, Lincoln, Nebraska, is 115, and I've lived here, a decade, and I don't think we've reached 110 in the actual air temperature. So you get these local extremes in a normal or slowly changing climate, but with climate change, in the pace of it on the order of years, you're seeing profound changes in how the Earth actually functions, and it's producing the numerous extreme events all over the world, and events that are set up like one commenter just mentioned dominoes. It's a domino effect of other events that lead up to an event somewhere else down the line. So for me, I mean, when I see all these extreme fires, these titanic fires, this ridiculous heat, and all these weird places, for me, it's really easy for me to signal that this is the effect of climate change occurring in these places and are all around the world, particularly because these events are happening all around the world at one time, at any given time.
Community all around the world has to work together. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we have to treat it like it's a global event, because it is. Yeah.
Well, this paper indicate the psychological vulnerability to climate change impacts is determined by the resilience of individuals and their community. On this basis, the suggestion is the climate change and extreme weather should be viewed as a challenge to be met with social engagement, pro-environmental action, and attitudes that serve to buffer its negative impact as much as possible. I really like this research thing. And then Heidi, and I didn't mean to cut you off, Jen, but Heidi's got a really big comment here, but I can't put it on the page. But I am going to read it really quick. We all might want to look into the transition towns movement, which is all about the concept of neighborhoods being self-sufficient without the use of fossil fuels to take care of each other's needs. It's about taking an inventory of what we have to offer our communities, both in terms of services and material objects like gardening tools, chainsaws, and matching them to the needs of the community. I was blessed to have met its founder, Rob Hopkins, at a workshop here in Portland, Maine a few years ago. Those are the kinds of movements I'm talking about, and see why I couldn't put it up, because it takes up the whole. But thank you, Heidi, because that's wonderful. Heidi, what an activist she is. Okay, Jen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I saw a comment come through a little earlier. I think it might be from Karen, but somebody commented on the jet stream or the lack thereof. And, let's all kind of remember that, I mean, climate change is happening everywhere, but the place that it's really happening is the Arctic. And that's where everything is melting. And that's where the delta of hot to cold is changing so quickly. And that's where permafrost is becoming permamush. And that's where all the soot is going to settle from all these Alaska wildfires And that's where all the methane is coming up. And that's where it's the crown of our Earth. And the crown of our Earth is changing so quickly that we can't even comprehend the vast changes that this is going to affect. And the melting and the demise of the Arctic is of monolithic proportions and affects absolutely every weather pattern and consequently civilization on Earth, because that more than anything is driving this chaotic, abrupt climate emergency.
Yeah, I mean it's the melting of the Arctic is dramatic beyond anything that I could possibly imagine. I mean it's truly incredible. Especially since in the past 10 or 15 years, it's the amount of ice melting off of Greenland, the Greenland ice sheet, which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years in its up until its most recent state. The sea ice. I mean, the sea ice. Back in the 1700s used to extend well into the North Atlantic and the beef in the. I mean, it's just the amount of change that we've seen in the Arctic is profound, and I don't I don't think words can really appreciate just how severe it is, how extreme it is. But I mean, it's for such a large area of the planet, a large sector of the planet, 60 to 65 north and north of that, to see such dramatic rises in temperatures, destruction of forests in fires or droughts, and mass death of trees. Most people just don't live up there, and so it's been still a relatively pristine place. But even to see like temperatures of that, and even humidity in parts of Alaska this past week that's comparable to what I've experienced here in Nebraska. That to me was kind of, took my breath away. Just to see these kind of temperatures. I mean, there were places that were getting temperatures close to what Nebraska my town in Lincoln has experienced this year, like mid to upper 90s.
Wow.
So it's yeah. I mean, I just it's scary. There's really no other way to put it. It's scary because I've looked at 2014, 15, 16, and we've seen these more dramatic changes in the state of affairs in the global climate, in the Arctic climate. But it really seems like 2019 is sort of like hitting the wall of that exponential curve, where suddenly every month that goes by, something more dramatic is happening than in the previous month or months.
Right.
Like how can we have a flood that was a record in March be exceeded in June or July? How can we see huge temperature anomalies, 40, 50 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, 60 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, even in the Arctic in winter, which was a pattern that really ramped up in the past couple of years in the Arctic. But then we start seeing these 30, 40 degree above normal temperatures in summertime. So now you're seeing 80s, 90-degree heat in the Arctic in the summer. It just seems like there's been something that's sort of flipped a switch in 2019 that seems very different from 2018 and 2017.
I totally agree, and I won't be long, but I totally agree. This is kind of like we have turned a curve in that hockey stick, and we are into a different kind of exponentiation that we haven't seen before. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it's getting to the point where I cannot report like I used to do every few days or every week I would revise a page on my Patreon blog that was sort of updating on extreme heat events, and I'd had events going since last year, 2017 to present. But by about April, there was so many happening that I didn't have time to update them anymore.
Wow.
There were so many
Wow.
record heat events, in India and in Europe and in Australia and in America. It was just like, man, I can't keep up with this anymore. Even this past week, I've seen so many extremes going on in different parts of the world. It's hard to report on them all because there's so many happening.
Nick,
It's really it puts that statement that climatologists, climate scientists have talked about for years, where the extremes become normal. It really puts this week in the past couple of weeks, it's really felt like the extremes are now normal. It's normal to have a 20, 30, 40-inch rain event, or have a 5 or 6 inches of rain in an hour, or have fires and 90-degree heat in Alaska like we had in Siberia last year, or to have record low sea ice and these records, in extreme heat in
right.
India and Europe. It's now it's just another week.
Nick, could you explain the thermohaline, which Matt says would be considered the warming of the climate? He mentioned in a couple of comments about the thermohaline.
Yeah, it's the global circulation pattern in the ocean, and
Okay.
it's driven by the exchange of fresh water and salt water, and warmer water to the south and colder water to the north, and you typically have that water sink in the high latitudes, and it basically recycles and circulates cold and warm water between the top upper layer of the ocean and the deep ocean. And basically, the concern is that as Greenland continues to melt and it accelerates in its melt, you have fresh water that's coming out. It's colder, but it's less dense than the salt water coming up from the south. And so as a result, it slows the circulation, the thermohaline circulation, down between the tropics and the high latitudes.
Okay.
And we've already started to notice this increasing cold pool south of Greenland. It shifts a little bit. We might be closer to Greenland and we're closer to North America during the course of the year, but it's this persistent, abnormally cold water surrounded by extremely abnormally warm water. And the the Gulf Stream is like right up against it. So you have this very abnormally hot Gulf Stream within this cold pool that's been persistent the past several years. And that's what you would expect in a scenario where the thermohaline circulation is slowing down. And in fact, there's been studies showing that since the past 50 or 60 years, it's been slowing down pretty dramatically. And obviously, if it gets to a point to where your circulation, deep circulations in the ocean slow down, there's a couple things that could happen. One has been discussed by James Hansen, where you actually get an acceleration in melt from Greenland because of it, because basically all the heat in the surrounding ocean goes into melting the ice sheet, and that goes into making the cold pool colder. But then you get more heat that's drawn up in the atmosphere because of this very intense temperature gradient that develops between Greenland and the North Atlantic, generating storms that go up into the Arctic, destroy sea ice, but also warm the Greenland dramatically, melting more ice. Then at the same time, that sea level rise is global. That sea level rise begins to encroach more and more onto the ice sheets that are calving off of Antarctica, because a lot of the Antarctic ice sheets, they're sitting on bedrock that's below sea level currently, And so as the ocean warms and rises, that warm ocean rises, it can cause an acceleration of melt off of Antarctica as well, accelerating sea level rise even faster, because now you get Antarctica involved in what's happening, but it's a feedback based on what's happening near Greenland. It's really weird, but it's a very profound effect if Hansen is in fact correct about that.
Wow.
Yeah, and then the other problem is that if you do not have a adequate ocean circulations, you end up getting extreme warming of the upper ocean compared to the lower ocean, and this creates a stratification. So basically, warmth on top of cold air, cold water can't rise, and so you get a stratification where there's no mixing. There's no mixing of nutrients. There's no mixing of oxygen, and so that produces a mass death of sea life because they don't have the adequate oxygen, and it can create the situation that many people refer to. It's named after the scientists that discuss this. This called the Canfield Ocean, where the life forms die in mass and release hydrogen sulfide in their rotting, and that pollutes the atmosphere, so it's killing life on the surface.
Regarding that Canfield Ocean, Nick, it's already happening off the coast of Namibia. There's hydrogen sulfide coming up there, and you can see in satellite pictures that Canfield Ocean, it's kind of a different color, and it's off the coast of Namibia in Africa.
Yeah, I've heard of areas that are starting to get like more death of species and large algae blooms that persist, that themselves are killing off the other life, because it either removes oxygen, limits photosynthesis because they're sitting on the surface and there isn't adequate light getting through, or other problems with anoxic ocean regions, and those areas are growing exponentially. Those areas of ocean that are oxygen deprived are growing very, very rapidly. I mean, we've seen what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico from all of the um, industrial chemicals. I mean, that's another anthropogenic effect. Climate change creates these extremes, which end up spreading more and more pollution, industrial pollution, other nutrients that are part of agriculture into the water, cause huge algae blooms or poison the animals, marine life, and they die. We've seen that in the Gulf of Mexico, and then of course on the west coast of North America, we're seeing death of birds, of whales, and other species because of loss of sea ice in the Arctic, and the other habitats for either their habitats or the habitats of their food. And so some of these animals, particularly the whales, are starving.
Well, that affects a lot of people. And when we put articles like that up on the page on animals, people are just, really profoundly affected.
Yeah.
I have a question from, where was it? I think it was actually Kent said, hope Nick is going to tell us how big a hit NOLA is going to take.
Oh, well, I don't think anyone knows. I think it's going to be very close whether that water will rise to the level or above the level of the levees. I had a friend, a Facebook friend. I actually went to school with her at Mississippi State. She's a TV meteorologist in New Orleans. Her name's Alexandra Cranford. She posted that the levees on the Mississippi protect the city up to a height of 20 feet. So if the river gets near or above, then you can get overtopping of those levees. So in the forecast that I've seen in the past day and today have been fluctuating between 19 and 20 feet of flood stage base. and I think the record's like a little over 21 feet. It was about 15 feet during Hurricane Katrina because most of the flooding came from Lake Pontchartrain, not from in the levees on the Mississippi held, but it could get really close, and if it does, it's a bad situation because there's people still mostly in the city. There hasn't been a mass evacuation of New Orleans like there was in 2005.
Not
Um,
yet. We don't
yeah,
know.
well, yeah, before the storm hit. I mean, the storm's hitting now, so
Oh,
um,
nobody's leaving.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Hurricane Trina was a Category 5 when it
Right.
was approaching on August 28th, 2005. This is a tropical storm. Most people aren't going to run from a tropical storm just because of rain, but
Right.
when you have a city that sits below sea level in a bowl that's quickly being threatened by rising seas and giant rainmakers of
Yep.
storms because of
Pretty
climate
scary.
change, it scares. It's much more scary for the people in New Orleans, or it should be, than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's a different world now, and something like a tropical storm could produce significant destruction in New Orleans if it does that.
It is a different world because everything is already saturated. Lake Pontchartrain is high, the Mississippi River is high, the sea level is a little tiny bit higher than it used to be, and the amount of moisture that these things are packing is greater. And this is a very slow storm, so it can just kind of like grind itself in. So we don't know what's going to happen. So blessings to all the people in New Orleans, and
Yeah.
stay safe.
Yeah.
Well, listen, guys, we are approaching an hour, so let's look at a couple of comments. Patricia says, "Poor Big Easy. These people have been through so much. All the music in the world can't mend their broken hearts." And Matt says the levees are going to be pushed. Oh, and actually, Mike just said evacuations have been ordered in NOLA. So maybe that's recent. Well, listen, guys, what do you think? An hour is a good time. And I'd like to hear your closing statements. I want to thank everybody, though, for coming. And Catherine Petrillo and Kent Deal and Patricia Jardine, who followed us from YouTube and would like us to be able to stream from Facebook to YouTube or vice versa. And we're learning. We're going to get there. And Jennifer and I are going to work together on trying to figure all this crap out because, takes two sometimes to tango. And then Nicholas, all you have to do is sit back and let us do the work.
Sounds good.
So who wants to do their closing statement first?
Well, I just think that community is the most important. We have to share our hearts and our minds. That's why we're gathered here today together, because we feel compelled to just kind of share this knowledge together as it's happening. This is real time climate crisis breakdown, and it's so disastrous and tragic and exciting and engrossing and all sorts of things. So I think this is a great time to form community and share all these times and comments together.
Absolutely. Nick?
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the issues is that a lot of people just see the world differently, and they don't see it from a global, both a local perspective and a global perspective. And so we face this emergency with our rapidly changing climate as a globe, but yet we have to understand that these events aren't just happening far away on some distant shore, but are happening here as well. And we have to be able to, be able to um, have the links, among the communities, big and small, from the big cities to the smallest towns, to be able to deal with these crises. Because, like you said earlier, we're not going to be all going away anytime soon. But a lot of us are going to be under direct threat from some of the dangers that the weather is going to pose against us, the weather and then the effects from our food and our water supplies. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of that in India, and people are having to decide whether to be the best people or the worst they can be. We have to be able to understand what's happening so that we can have the ability to hopefully get through it to the best of our ability and be able to bring out the best of ourselves.
And that's what we do. That's what we do. Well, listen, guys, I think this has been a good show, and we will do this again. We're getting more regular. Antonio Reed was supposed to join us tonight, but he had to go to work. And it would have been great to have him with us because I can fit 4 people on the screen. But next time.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I want to thank everybody for coming. All of you. Thank you so very much. We will be back. So I will do my usual, and thanks, Nick and Jen. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Peace. You guys stay on for a second. Good night.